There was nothing, no improvements on this ranch over here except fences until 1976 or so. My brother and I had graduated from Montana State, and we were still living on the west side, but we came over and put some irrigation over here because we knew that we were going to sell the west side over there. My grandparents and parents wanted to retire, which left us with no land base except for this over here. So we started moving over here. We started irrigating these two pieces, actually just this piece, in 1976. And in 1978, I got married and moved up here and built this house in the fall of 1978. And my brother got married a couple years later and moved into this house, built this house in, I think, 1981. Originally, we had hand line and wheel lines, and we irrigated basically this square here and down to halfway here. And this little patch right here. And that was with wheel lines. And then a couple years later, we expanded and put more wheel lines on, and then we irrigated basically all of this that you see is green here, and a little bit more of this. And then in the 80s, let's see, 80s, no, 90s. I'm having a hard time remembering when we put the pivots in, exact time, but it was in the 90s. We put those, both these pivots in, and then that expanded our irrigation to where it is today. The increase in irrigation was more for selling hay. We didn't have the range base to produce any more cattle. Fact is, our cattle actually went down. In the 1970s, we ran about 400 head of cattle, and towards the end, we were running about 300 head. It was dry. We had a bunch of drought years during from the 80s through the 90s. The climate's warming, less rain. We just didn't have the base for it. We leased a lot of land back in Plum Creek here. The cows ran on a lot more acreage, but we still didn't have the range for more cattle. So our cattle numbers were going down, and we sold, to make up for that income, we sold hay and sometimes some grain that we'd raised under irrigation. When my grandmother inherited this place, it was 4,400 acres. And of that 4,400 acres, it was from this corner here, basically straight across to section 16, right here. This piece of ground, my brother and I bought in 1988, I believe, or in the late 80s sometime in there. It was another 1,800 acres or so. My aunt owned that, and she wanted to get rid of it. So we purchased it from her. But of the 4,400 acres, most everything on the lower 1/4 of it has been reseeded. Anything that wasn't too steep to get a tractor on. A lot of this over here was native range, and it was pretty depleted native range because it had been had too much livestock on it for too many years, especially the lower range. So we've reseeded 1,000, maybe 1,500 acres of all of this lower range into grass species that produce more and work better for cattle operation. That's been done over 50 years. Most of the grasses we planted were crested wheatgrass, Sherman big bluegrass, intermediate and pubescent wheatgrass, and Russian wild rye. That's basically what we planted into. And then we had some alfalfa planted with that too. We seeded, a lot of this was originally seeded into intermediate wheatgrass and Sherman Big Blue, the original plantings that we did probably in the 60s more, my father actually. Basically the same area as these fields at this lower 1/4 all the way through here. They were basically intermediate wheatgrass, and it lasted probably 15 years. And then just a combination of some dry years, overgrazing. They broke down, and so we farmed all that ground again, not in 1 year, but over a series of probably 5 years, and reseeded more into crested wheatgrass because it was a little more drought tolerant, and we were actually needed spring grass more than the warm season grass that intermediate was. So we moved the intermediate wheatgrass to the highest places that we could farm, up on these ridges here and up above my house up in here. We left that intermediate, and this field here used to be all intermediate, and we've took it all out. And the latest grasses that we planted was crested, and that was probably in the late 80s and early 90s. We really haven't expanded anything that wasn't already plowed. That was one thing that I forgot. In 1919 and 18, during the First World War, they really needed grain. So my great-grandfather and one of his boys farmed everything that's been farmed now that was all put into wheat. They had a great year. I think they loaded out at Florence like 100 rail cars of wheat. Not just off of this, but they farmed all the way, everything that he owned, and he had thousands of more acres than this. But they dug everything they could dig, and they had a great year. So everything that is put into grass now, tame grasses, was probably farmed at least once and maybe twice, because I think they tried raising grain till 1920s, and I think 1923 was not only another recession, deep recession, but it was a crop failure, and they went from doing real good in 2 or 3 years to broke again, and then they started putting that back into grasses again. Maybe some of it was never even reseeded until years and years later. Maybe it was just left to come back by its own. Up until 1978, we only summered the cattle over here. Then we would either run them around on the road through Florence and down the railroad tracks over to Lolo, or we would bring them across the river, depending on how iced up it was, or how deep the water was. Most of the time, we'd bring them right across and just bring them through the timber here and chase them across the river. We just summered here, and then we fed all the cows on the west side, because that's where our hay base was, until we moved over here in 70s, when Jim and I moved over here. Then we had the hay base here. We left the cows here year round. We needed more water then, especially winter water. So that's when we put the springs, developed springs not only for the houses, but for the cattle. And we put those in concrete tanks around, scattered them over the ranch. And that was mostly done during the 1980s, early 80s.